British Prime Minister Theresa May has criticised social media companies for providing safe spaces, as she puts it, where extremism can incubate, following a deadly terror attack in London over the weekend, just a short distance from where we sit here today at the Financial Times. I'm here with my Lex team colleague Jonathan Ely to discuss how the companies might stand up to the challenges that are approaching them. And I guess really our starting point, Jonathan, is what do they do at the moment in terms of moderating and policing what is on their networks?
So at the moment, it's almost entirely a reactive model. So if you report a beheading video on YouTube or a sort of fiery anti-Western sermon on Facebook, for instance, that goes through to a moderator, and they pledge to look at that and to, if necessary, take it down within a certain period of time. Now, when the Home Affairs Select Committee cross-examined executives from these three companies earlier this year, they produced an interim report. It came out shortly before or just after the election was called. And it was fair to say it was coruscating in its language, using adjectives like dreadful, indefensible, irresponsible, saying, first of all, that these companies do not act quickly enough, in many cases on tip-offs, and that they do not take any responsibility themselves. They outsource that effectively to their user bases and to various NGOs and taxpayer-funded organisations. So effectively, we the taxpayer and we the public are doing their job for them, and they of course dispute that and say, well, we're not here to decide which views we find politically palatable or not. We are just here to deal with content that violates our user guidelines and that is illegal.
It's a great business model though, isn't it? Because if you outsource policing to your user base, then you have very low relative costs compared.
Absolutely, they have fabulous margins, because not only do they not pay for any of their content effectively, it's all user generated, they're also relying on users to do most of the editing. That leaves basically most of their cost base is technology and staff.
What did you find when you tried to see what the impact would be on the margins of some of the social networking companies if they had to have the same level of scrutiny of the material that they are publishing?
So what I did was I looked at Trinity Mirror, which is a UK media company. It produces a national newspaper, lots of regional newspapers, and lots of websites. Now their staff costs as a percentage of their sales revenue are 36%. Now if we assume that a third of those costs are editorial costs, a third of 36 is 12. Trinity Mirror has to employ journalists to generate the news, and then it has to employ editors and production staff to check what the journalists have written. Now Facebook, YouTube and so on, they don't have to employ people to generate content because their users generate it for them for free. So if we assume that perhaps half of the editorial expenses don't apply to them and we just take the other half, that would be 6% of revenue. Now for comparison, Facebook's total expenses, everything that it spends as a proportion of revenue, are around 11%. So you can see that if they had to, in extremis, adopt all the costs and all the checks and balances that a conventional media company has to incur, then their operating expenses would rise by 50%. And if you apply that number to, say, their European advertising revenue, they would incur an extra $385 million worth of costs, which is certainly not company threatening, but it's not insignificant either.
So it does narrow their margins. I mean, that's quite a big increase in their costs. And if you were to apply it globally, say if the United States began to feel the same way as some politicians seem to feel in Europe, then it could diminish their attractiveness as an investment quite considerably, couldn't it?
Yes, it would certainly. There's no indication at this stage that their revenue growth would be affected, but the margin that they are making on that revenue would be smaller, and therefore in share prices working the way they do, you would not want to pay as much for the shares if you don't think the company is going to make as much profit as you thought it was going to do.